The silence of the mountain was the only language Alara had spoken for 6 years. It was a language of wind through pines, the crackle of a fire laying claim to dry wood, the distant cry of a hawk circling on a thermal. She had come to this high, lonely place to forget the sounds of men's voices, the clipped orders of surgeons in bloody tents, the groans of the dying, and the final whispered word of her husband, his name a ghost on her own lips. Her cabin was a fortress built of solitude, its walls chinked with a quiet grief that had long since hardened into simple existence. She was 34, with strands of silver woven at her temples like early frost, and hands that were as competent with an axe as they were with a needle and thread. She had survived a war, a plague, and the particular cruelty of a town that whispered witch when what they meant was widow. Here she was only a healer, and her only patients were the seasons themselves, which she sutured together with planting and harvesting, chopping and preserving. Then came a new sound, one that did not belong. It was the desperate, stumbling rhythm of a horse pushed past its limits, the frantic crashing through undergrowth, followed by a heavy, final thud that shook the packed earth before her door. Alara set down the pestle, the scent of crushed yarrow clinging to her fingers, and rose without haste. Fear was a luxury she had discarded years ago. She moved to the door, her hand resting on the smooth, worn wood, and listened. A low groan, the sound of a man trying to draw a breath that was filled with wet gravel. She opened the door. He lay sprawled at the foot of her steps, a heap of denim and dust, one arm flung out as if reaching for something he'd never grasp. The horse, a fine-looking bay slick with sweat and trembling, stood with its head low, reins tangled in a juniper bush. The man's shirt, once a dark blue, was now a stiff, blackened map of ruin centered on his left side, just below the ribs. She went to him, her steps measured. Kneeling, she put her fingers to his neck. The pulse was there, thready and fast, a trapped bird beating against a cage of bone. His face was pale under a layer of grime and stubble, his lips tinged with blue. His eyes were closed, but his jaw was clenched, a testament to a pain that went beyond consciousness. Alara was not a woman given to softness, but she knew the architecture of dying. This man was a house whose foundation was crumbling. She looked from his still form to the vast, indifferent expanse of the mountains. There was no one else. There was never anyone else. With a sigh that was more air than sound, she made a decision. She could not leave him to the coyotes and the cold. Her vow of silence had been a shield, but it was not a shroud to be cast over another soul. Getting him inside was a battle. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She hooked her hands under his arms and dragged, her boots digging into the dirt for purchase. He was a long scar of disturbed earth leading to her doorway. Inside, the cabin was one room, clean and spare. A stone hearth, a narrow bed, a table with her herbs and tools laid out in careful order. She pulled him onto the bearskin rug before the fire, the heat of the embers a small mercy against the chill clinging to his clothes. His breathing was worse now, a ragged, hitching sound. The smell of him filled the small space, sweat, horse, pine, and the unmistakable coppery tang of blood. So much blood. She looked at the stain spreading across her floor, a dark flower blooming on the wood, and felt nothing but the cold, clear focus of the work ahead. She had not chosen this, but it had come to her door. And Alara, who had forgotten the language of men, still knew the grammar of a wound. She turned to the hearth, stoked the fire, and set a kettle of water to boil. The work had begun. The medical encounter was a ritual, a silent liturgy she knew by heart. First, the cutting away of the cloth. Her shears, honed to a razor's edge, sliced through the stiff, blood-caked denim of his shirt. The fabric peeled back to reveal the wound, a puckered, angry mouth in the flesh of his side. It was a gunshot, close range by the powder burns that ghosted the edges of the skin. The bullet was still inside. She could feel the hard knot of it beneath the muscle when she pressed gently, her fingers reading the topography of the damage. He didn't flinch, but a low sound escaped his lips, a vibration of pure agony that he tried to swallow. His eyes fluttered open, dark and clouded with pain, and for a moment, they focused on her face. He saw a woman who was not young, her expression unreadable, her hands steady as they moved over his body with an impersonal grace. He saw the silver in her hair catching the firelight. He saw no fear in her. He closed his eyes again, a silent surrender. Ilara worked without pause, her movements economical and precise. She washed her hands in a basin of hot water and carbolic soap, the harsh scent a familiar comfort. She laid out her tools on a clean linen cloth beside him. A slender silver probe, forceps, a curved needle, and a spool of silk thread. Everything was clean. Her husband, a man of science even in the chaos of a field hospital, had drilled that into her. "Cleanliness is a prayer the body answers," he used to say. She poured a generous measure of whiskey into a cup and knelt beside the man again. "Drink this," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. It startled her as much as it did him. He opened his eyes, surprised, and looked at her. She pushed the cup to his lips, tipping it. He coughed, the raw spirit burning his throat, but he drank it all. Then she took a strip of clean leather and held it out. "Bite on this." He took it between his teeth without question. She dipped the probe into the whiskey, the alcohol a clear, cold baptism, and then she began. The probe entered the wound, a delicate, terrible exploration. She felt the muscles contract around the metal, saw the cords in his neck stand out as he fought the pain. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the rug, but he made no sound, save for the strained hiss of his breath through his teeth, clamped tight on the leather. She worked by feel, her mind a calm, quiet space where only the wound existed. She pictured the path of the bullet, the torn tissue, the blood vessels weeping into the cavity. He watched her, his vision blurring. He saw the intense concentration on her face, the slight furrow of her brow. Her face was inches from his chest. He could smell the yarrow on her skin, a clean, bitter scent that cut through the metallic odor of his own blood. He trusted her hands. He had no choice, but it was more than that. He saw a competence so absolute it felt like a form of grace. The probe found it, a faint, grating click of metal on metal. There. She withdrew the probe and picked up the forceps, their slender jaws sterilized in the same whiskey. This was the worst part. She spoke again, her voice still a stranger in the room. "Hold still." It was not a request. He nodded, a barely perceptible movement, his eyes fixed on the ceiling beams above. She went in with the forceps, following the path she had mapped. It was a blind search, a prayer of steel and nerve. She gripped the lead, felt the satisfying weight of it in the tool's jaws. Then she pulled. It was a slow, agonizing withdrawal, tearing what was already torn. A strangled cry was torn from his throat, muffled by the leather. His whole body went rigid, a bowstring pulled taut, and then it was out. The bullet, misshapen and slick with blood, dropped onto the linen cloth with a soft thud. He sagged, the tension leaving him in a rush. His breath came in shuddering gasps. Ilara ignored the bullet. It was the past. She was concerned with the future. She took a clean cloth, soaked it in the remaining whiskey, and began to clean the wound. The sting of it a fresh, sharp shock after the deep, tearing pain. He bore it in silence, his eyes closed once more. She was a force of nature, this quiet woman, as relentless and as necessary as a storm that washes the world clean. She threaded the needle with the smooth, dark silk. Her stitches were small and even, a surgeon's work. Each pass of the needle through his skin was a deliberate act, a mending. The room was quiet now, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft, rhythmic pull of thread through flesh. He had spat out the leather, his jaw aching. He watched her again, his mind clearer now that the fire of the bullet was gone, replaced by the cleaner burn of her work. The whiskey hummed in his veins, dulling the edges of the world. Her head was bent, the firelight catching the elegant line of her neck. He saw the calluses on her fingers, the practical, unadorned strength in her hands. There was no ring. He registered that detail with a clarity that surprised him. This woman was alone. She worked with a focus that seemed to shut out everything else. The world, the man she was saving, perhaps even herself. It was just her, the needle, and the wound, a trinity of healing in a silent cabin on a lonely mountain. He felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He was in her hands. It was enough. As she pulled the final stitch tight, knotting it with a swift, practiced movement, the silence in the room seemed to deepen, to become something shared. He let out a long, slow breath, the first easy one he'd taken in hours. Her work was nearly done. She had cleaned him, probed him, and stitched him back together, all without knowing his name. He watched her snip the thread, her movements economical and sure. The wound was closed, a neat dark line against the pale of his skin. The bleeding had stopped. He felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it was like sinking into deep water. But before he let it take him, there were words that needed to be said. The silence had been broken by her voice, a tool she used as precisely as her needle. Now it was his turn. His own voice was a dry rasp, barely a whisper. "What's your name?" She looked up from her work, her eyes meeting his for the first time without the filter of medical assessment. They were gray eyes, clear and direct, the color of a winter sky. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if remembering how to perform this simple human exchange. "Ilara," she said. The name felt strange on her tongue, an artifact from another life. 6 years. 6 years since she had offered her name to a man. It felt like giving away a piece of herself she had long thought buried. She finished cleaning her tools, her back to him, rinsing them in the basin and wiping them dry. The small domestic sounds were loud in the quiet room. He waited. When she turned back, a clean linen bandage in her hands, she asked the question he was expecting. "Yours?" "Silas," he replied. He offered nothing more. A single name was enough for now. It was all he had the strength for. She nodded, accepting it. She began to dress the wound, her fingers light and cool against his fevered skin. The bandage was a clean, white promise against the raw trauma beneath. "You do this like a surgeon," he said, his voice a little stronger now. He watched her face, trying to read the story there. "I learned from one," she said, her voice flat, offering no invitation for more questions. She smoothed the last edge of the bandage down. The intimacy of the procedure was over, replaced by a more formal distance. But the connection forged in that silence and pain remained. It was a tangible thing, humming in the air between them. He shifted slightly, and a sharp, electric pain shot through his side, making him gasp. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice sharp with authority. "The stitches will tear." He gritted his teeth. "Hurts." "It's supposed to," she said, without sympathy but not without kindness. It was a simple statement of fact. Pain was part of the process. She had a deep and abiding respect for pain. It was the body's truth-teller. She had finished her work. The wound was clean, closed, and bandaged. The man, Silas, lay on her floor, breathing more evenly now. The immediate danger had passed. She stood up, her knees cracking in protest, and looked down at him. A stranger was bleeding on her floor, a man with a name and a bullet story she did not know. Her fortress of silence had been breached, not by force, but by a simple, desperate need she could not ignore. The quiet of her life was gone, replaced by the sound of another's breathing. The procedure was over, but the care was not. The night stretched before them, a long, dark passage. He was weak, feverish, and vulnerable. She was the sole guardian of his recovery. "The wound must be kept dry," she instructed, her voice falling back into its professional, dispassionate cadence. "You will not move from this spot for 2 days, not unless you want me to do that all over again." She looked at him, her gray eyes leaving no room for argument. He met her gaze and gave a slight, tired nod. He understood the terms. He was her patient, her prisoner, until the body decided otherwise. He accepted it. There was a strange comfort in yielding control to hands so capable. She moved about the cabin, her routine reasserting itself, but now it was altered to include him. She tended the fire, adding logs until it blazed, chasing the deep chill from the room. She fetched a pillow from her own bed and gently lifted his head, sliding it beneath him. Her touch was firm, impersonal, yet the simple comfort of it was immense. He murmured something, a sound of gratitude too low to be a word. She went to her stores and took down a slab of dried venison and some root vegetables. Soon, the cabin filled with the rich, savory smell of broth simmering over the fire. It was a scent of life, of sustenance, a stark contrast to the smell of blood and whiskey that had dominated the space just an hour before. Through the night, she did not sleep. She sat in her straight-backed chair by the fire, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and watched him. She was a sentry guarding a fragile peace. His fever rose as she knew it would. He began to mutter in his sleep, his limbs twitching. He spoke of dust and cattle, of a name, Thorn, spat out like a curse. He spoke of a river and a fence line, fragments of a life, a conflict that had led him, bleeding, to her door. Ilara listened, piecing together a narrative she hadn't asked for. Each time his fevered movements threatened to disturb the wound, she was there, a cool, damp cloth on his forehead, a steadying hand on his shoulder, a quiet murmur of, "Easy now, lie still." He would surface from the fever dreams, his eyes finding her in the flickering firelight. She was a constant, a still point in his swirling pain and confusion. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the resolute set of her jaw. She was tending to him not out of duty, but out of something deeper, something he couldn't name. It was a profound and solemn watchfulness. Once, waking near dawn, he found her asleep in the chair, her head slumped to one side, the blanket having slipped to the floor. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. A deep cold was seeping into the cabin. He saw the vulnerability in her then, the weariness of a woman holding a line all by herself. He felt a fierce, protective urge, which was absurd, given his own helplessness. He was the wounded one, yet he wanted to rise and put the blanket back over her. When the first pale light of morning filtered through the single window, she was awake, moving quietly to rekindle the fire. She brought him a cup of the broth, now strained and clear. "Drink," she said. She supported his head, holding the cup to his lips. The broth was hot, salty, and felt like life itself pouring back into him. He drank it all, his eyes on her face. The impersonal mask of the healer was still there, but he was beginning to see the cracks in it. He saw the faint lines of a past smile around her mouth, the deep well of sorrow in her eyes. He was no longer just a wound to be mended. He was a presence in her home, a man she was keeping alive through the force of her will. And she, in turn, was no longer just a pair of steady hands. She was Ilara, a woman with a past, a woman who had chosen to help him when no one else was there. The first signs of a fragile, unspoken recognition were beginning to dawn between them, as quiet and as certain as the morning light cresting over the mountain peaks. 2 days passed in the quiet rhythm of care and recovery. Silas kept to the bearskin rug, his body a map of pain that slowly began to recede. Ilara tended to him with a diligent, almost monastic focus. She changed his dressing, cleaned the wound, and fed him broth and thin gruel. The fever broke on the second night, leaving him weak but clear-headed. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of things unsaid, a patient curiosity. On the third evening, he was strong enough to sit up, propped against a rolled-up blanket, his back to the warm stones of the hearth. The fire danced, casting long shadows that made the small room feel like a world unto itself. Ilara sat across from him, mending one of her own shirts, her needle moving with the same steady precision she'd used on his skin. The air was different now, the tension of crisis replaced by a quiet companionship. It was he who broke the silence first. "You never said how you learned," he said, his voice stronger than it had been. "To stitch a man up like that." She didn't look up from her sewing. "My husband was a doctor, an army surgeon." The words came out evenly, a statement of a past she had packed away like winter clothes. "I was his nurse, in the field mostly. There was a lot of practice." She bit off the thread, her movement sharp and final. He absorbed this. It explained the skill, the lack of flinching, the calm authority. She had seen far worse than him. "The war?" he asked gently. "Yes," she said. She folded the mended shirt and set it aside, finally meeting his eyes. The firelight softened the hard lines of her face, revealing a deep-seated weariness. "He didn't die from a bullet. It was the fever. It took more men than the fighting ever did." She looked into the flames, her gaze distant. "We had a son. It took him, too. Not the war, but what came after. Diphtheria, the town. They had their own ideas about sickness, about me. A woman who knew what I knew." She fell silent, the implication hanging in the air. A woman who understood the mechanics of death was too close to it for their comfort. They feared what they couldn't understand. "So you came up here," Silas finished for her, his voice low. "There was nothing left for me down there," she said simply. "The mountain doesn't whisper. It doesn't judge. It just is." She had revealed more of herself in those few sentences than she had to anyone in years. It was a risk, a crack in the fortress wall, and she felt a tremor of vulnerability run through her. Now it was his turn. The exchange required balance. He owed her a piece of his own story. "I got this," he began, gesturing to his side, "over a fence line, or where a fence line is supposed to be." He took a breath. "My family's ranch is in the valley south of here, the Blackwood place. We've been running cattle there for 2 generations. The stream that waters our whole south pasture, it starts up in the high country, on land Jedediah Thorne claims is his." He said the name again, and this time, Alara could hear the cold hatred in it. "Thorne's been buying up land, squeezing out the smaller outfits. He dammed the stream last month, said the water rights were his. My father tried to reason with him. I was less reasonable. I went up there with 2 of my ranch hands to cut the dam loose." He stared at his hands, remembering. "Thorne's men were waiting for us. It wasn't a fight. It was an ambush. I was the only one who got away." He looked at her, his eyes dark with the memory. "I was riding for the marshal in Silver Creek, but I knew I wouldn't make it. I just rode up, as high as the horse could carry me. I figured I'd rather die up here, in the clean air, than in Thorne's dusty yard." He didn't realize until he'd stopped speaking how much he'd needed to say it, to give his pain a history. He had ridden from a battle he'd lost, toward a justice he might never find. The cabin was silent again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the silence of shared truths, of wounds both visible and invisible laid bare in the firelight. She now saw him not as a nameless cowboy, but as Silas Blackwood, a man fighting for his home. And he saw her not just as a mountain healer, but as Alara, a widow and a mother who had built a sanctuary out of her own immense loss. The uneven exchange had tilted the world. She had given him the story of her retreat from the world of men. He had given her the story of his war within it, and in doing so, they had discovered they were not strangers, but survivors of different battles, now sharing the same small patch of truce ground. For a few more days, a fragile peace held within the cabin's walls. Silas grew stronger, graduating from the floor to the chair by the fire. He watched Alara as she moved through her daily rituals, grinding herbs, kneading dough, checking her snares. He learned the quiet language of her existence. He saw the way she would pause and listen to the wind, as if it were an old friend telling her a story. She, in turn, grew accustomed to his presence. The cabin felt less empty, his quiet breathing a counterpoint to the crackle of the fire. The name he had given her, Blackwood, resonated in her mind. The Blackwood Ranch was known throughout the territory, a long-standing outfit, respected. It was the other name, Thorne, that was a stone in her gut. Jedediah Thorne was a name spoken in hushed tones, a man who bought sheriffs and judges as easily as he bought cattle, a man whose ambition was a blight on the land. The identity reveal, when it came, was not a single moment but a slow dawning dread. It began when she was cleaning his coat, the one she'd cut from his body. It was a well-made coat, of a quality far above that of a simple hired hand. Tucked deep inside an inner pocket, she found a folded, blood-stained piece of paper. Her fingers, hesitant at first, unfolded it. It was a deed. A land grant for the Blackwood Ranch, signed and sealed, bearing the signature of the territorial governor. And tucked within it was a letter, written in a bold, authoritative hand, addressed to Silas. It was from his father, detailing their legal strategy against Thorne, mentioning witnesses, surveyors' reports, and a planned meeting with a federal marshal. This was not a simple fence line dispute. This was a war for the future of the entire valley. Silas saw her standing by the window, the papers in her hand, her face pale in the afternoon light. He knew then that the partial truth he'd offered was no longer enough. "My father is Augustus Blackwood," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Thorn doesn't just want our water. He wants our land. He believes there's silver in the hills behind our pasture. He's trying to break us, to force us to sell for pennies on the dollar before the surveyors can prove the claim." Ilara folded the papers carefully and placed them on the table. The truth of it settled over her, cold and heavy. She hadn't just saved a cowboy. She had saved the heir to the Blackwood Ranch, the key figure in a battle against the most dangerous man in the territory. Her small, isolated cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was now a hiding place, a liability. Thorn would not have stopped looking for him. If Silas was alive, he was a threat, a witness who could bring federal attention down on Thorn's operation. Thorn's men would be scouring every ravine, every line shack, every remote homestead. They would eventually think to look up, to the lonely cabin on the mountain where the reclusive healer lived. "He will kill you if he finds you," she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. It was a clinical assessment of the situation. "I know," Silas said, "and he'll kill anyone who helps me." His eyes met hers, and in that look, the entire dynamic shifted. He was no longer just her patient. He was a danger to her. His presence had brought the brutal, violent world of men, the very world she had fled, crashing into her quiet refuge. Everything that had passed between them was now recast in this new, perilous light. The intimacy of the healing, the shared stories by the fire, all of it was now tangled up with a land war and the threat of a man like Thorn. Her act of mercy had made her a target. She looked around her small, peaceful cabin, at the neat rows of drying herbs, the worn wooden table, the warm hearth. It was all she had left of a life. And she realized, with a chilling certainty, that it might not be hers for much longer. The knowledge of who Silas was and what hunted him settled over the cabin like a shroud. The quiet companionship of the previous days evaporated, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Every snap of a twig outside, every cry of a bird, was a potential threat. Ilara found herself scanning the tree line, her hand straying to the old hunting rifle she kept mounted over the hearth. Silas, too, was changed. His recovery was now a race against time. He pushed himself, testing his strength, his face set in grim lines. The peace of his convalescence was gone, replaced by the urgent need to be strong enough to fight or flee. He was a danger to her, and the guilt of it was a constant, bitter taste in his mouth. "I should leave," he said one morning, his voice low. He was standing, unsteady but upright, his hand braced against the mantelpiece. "The longer I stay, the more danger I put you in." "You can barely stand," Ilara countered, her voice sharp. "You'd be dead before you reached the valley floor, from the wound or from Thorn's men. It makes no difference which." Her pragmatism was a shield for the fear that was coiling in her gut. The thought of him leaving, wounded and alone, was as unbearable as the thought of Thorn's men arriving. The external threat materialized 3 days later. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting low through the pines, when Ilara saw them. 3 riders, moving slowly up the narrow track that led to her cabin. They were not lost hunters. They moved with a purpose, their eyes scanning the terrain. One of them she recognized from her rare trips to the general store years ago, a man named Cale, known to be Thorn's right hand, a man with cold, empty eyes and a reputation for casual cruelty. Her heart seized in her chest, a cold, hard fist. They were here. Inside. Now! She hissed at Silas, who was outside chopping kindling, an act of defiance against his own weakness. Get on the bed, under the blankets. Do not make a sound. There was no time to argue. Silas moved, his face pale but his eyes blazing. He slid onto her narrow cot, pulling the heavy quilts over himself, his hand instinctively going to the hunting knife he kept at his belt. Alara took a deep breath, schooling her features into a mask of placid indifference. She smoothed her apron, picked up her basket of herbs, and stepped onto her small porch, sitting on the top step as if she were merely enjoying the last of the day's sun. She began sorting through a handful of wintergreen leaves, her hands moving with a steadiness she did not feel. The riders drew up before the cabin, their horses blowing plumes of steam in the crisp mountain air. Cale dismounted, his spurs jingling with a sound of pure menace. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. He let his eyes roam over her, her cabin, the thin curl of smoke from her chimney. "We're looking for a man. Rode this way a week or so back. Goes by the name of Blackwood." Alara looked up from her leaves, her expression one of mild, detached curiosity. She did not speak. She simply met his gaze, her gray eyes unwavering. "He's wounded," Cale continued, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Took a bullet to the side. A man like that, he'd be looking for help. Maybe from a woman like you. The kind folks say has a knack for healing." The way he said the word made it sound like an accusation. This was the moment. The choice. Her fortress of solitude had been built for this exact purpose. To keep the world out. To keep herself safe. All she had to do was tell the truth. Or simply remain silent, step aside, and let them search. They would find him, and they would take him, and her life would return to its quiet, lonely equilibrium. Her pact with the mountain would be restored. But as she looked at Cale's dead eyes, she thought of Silas, of the trust in his face as she'd stitched his wound, of the story of his father's ranch, of the quiet way he'd listened to her own story of loss. He was not just a patient. He was a man who had seen her, truly seen her, for the first time in years. To give him up would be to betray not just him, but the part of herself that had begun to reawaken in his presence. She finally spoke, her voice calm and even, the voice of a woman who had nothing to hide. "I haven't seen anyone, man or beast, for months." She held his gaze without flinching. "The mountain is quiet this time of year." Cale's eyes narrowed. He searched her face for any sign of a lie, any flicker of fear. He saw nothing but a plain, solitary woman, her hands stained with herbs, her expression as impassive as the rock face behind her. He glanced at his men, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The story of the mountain witch, the strange woman who spoke to no one, was well known. Perhaps she was just what she seemed. "You mind if we take a look inside?" he pressed, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "Just to be sure." Alara stood up slowly, her body a deliberate shield before the door. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for her own rifle. She simply stood her ground, her presence suddenly immense. "This is my home," she said, her voice dropping, taking on a cold, hard edge that Cale had not expected. "The man you're looking for isn't here. Now get off my land." For a long, tense moment, the world held its breath. It was a battle of wills, fought in the thin mountain air. Cale weighed his options. Forcing his way past her could be trouble he didn't need, especially if they found nothing. Thorn wanted Blackwood, but he didn't want a war with the strange spirits of the mountains or the superstitions of his own men. He looked at Alara, at the unyielding certainty in her stance, and for the first time, he felt a prickle of unease. He made his decision. "All right, boys," he grunted, turning back to his horse. "We're wasting our time." He swung into the saddle, but before he left, he turned back to her, his eyes promising a future reckoning. "If we find out you're lying, ma'am, there's nowhere on this mountain you can hide." He wheeled his horse around, and with his men, galloped back down the trail, leaving a cloud of dust and a ringing silence in their wake. Ilara stood motionless on the porch, her heart hammering against her ribs, until the sound of their hoofbeats had faded completely into the vast quiet of the wilderness. Only then did she allow herself to tremble. She had made her choice. She had stepped between Silas and the rifle, and in doing so had bound her fate to his. The world she had so carefully shut out was now inside her home, lying wounded in her bed, and she, its sworn enemy, had just become its fiercest defender. When the last echo of the horses had gone, Ilara turned and walked back into the cabin, her legs unsteady. The door closed behind her with a soft click, shutting out the world once more. The room was dim, the fire having burned low. Silas was sitting up on the bed, the blankets pooled around his waist. In his hand, he held his hunting knife, the blade catching a faint gleam of light. His face was a mask of tension, his knuckles white where he gripped the hilt. He had heard everything. "They're gone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The adrenaline was leaving her, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She leaned against the door, her eyes closed for a moment, the solid wood a comfort at her back. He slid the knife back into its sheath. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and guilt. "He would have killed you." "He would have killed you," she corrected, opening her eyes to look at him. "My chances were better than yours." It was the simple, brutal pragmatism she lived by, but they both knew it was more than that. It was a choice, made in an instant, that had redefined everything between them. She had lied for him. She had faced down armed men for him. She, who had shunned the world of men, had just risked her life for one. He pushed himself off the bed and crossed the small room in 2 unsteady strides. He was still weak, the sudden tension having drained his reserves. He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the heat coming off his skin. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to assure himself she was real, that she was unharmed. His hand hovered in the air between them. "Why?" he asked, the word raw and honest. Ilara had no grand answer, no declaration. The reasons were a complex tangle of duty, compassion, and something new and frightening that she didn't have a name for. "You were in my house," she said finally, her gaze unwavering. "Under my care. I don't surrender my patients." It was the healer's creed, but it was also a woman's confession. In that moment, he was not Silas Blackwood, heir to a ranch and a feud. He was simply hers to protect, hers to mend. He saw the truth in her gray eyes, a truth that went far beyond her words. He saw the fierce loyalty she had hidden away from the world, now offered to him. Slowly he raised his hand and laid it gently against her cheek. His palm was rough, calloused, but his touch was incredibly gentle. It was the first tender touch she had felt in 6 years. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound, grateful recognition. It was a thank you. It was an acknowledgement of the monumental risk she had taken. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, a barely perceptible movement, a lifetime of guarded solitude yielding to this one small point of contact. The warmth of his hand spread through her, chasing away the last of the icy fear. He saw the tremor that went through her, the slight parting of her lips as she drew a shaky breath. He saw the walls she had built so carefully around herself crumble just for a moment. He looked down at her, at the silver in her hair, at the strength and sorrow in her face, and felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He had come to her cabin half dead, a stranger seeking refuge. He had found something more. He had found a woman who remembered how to fight. "Ilara," he murmured, his thumb stroking her skin. It was the first time he had spoken her name with such intimacy, letting it be more than just a label. It was a prayer. He lowered his head and pressed his lips to her forehead, a soft, chaste kiss that sealed the choice she had made. It was a kiss of fealty, of gratitude, of a bond forged in blood and lies. It spoke of safety chosen, of a shelter given and received. In the quiet of the cabin, with the threat of the world held at bay just outside the door, they stood together, no longer just a healer and her patient, but two solitary souls who had found an unexpected allegiance on a lonely mountain. The seasons turned. The threat of Jedediah Thorne did not vanish, but it receded, like a tide pulling back from the shore. News trickled up from the valley, carried by a friendly trapper who sometimes traded pelts with Ilara for herbal remedies. Thorne's ambush had not gone unnoticed. The two ranch hands Silas had believed dead had not been. One had survived, crawling his way to the marshal's office in Silver Creek. A federal investigation was underway. Thorne was occupied, his attention drawn downward to the world of lawmen and lawyers, away from the lone cabin in the high country. For a time they were safe. Silas did not leave. His wound healed, the neat line of Ilara's stitches fading from an angry red to a pale silver scar. His strength returned, and with it, he began to repay his debt not in coin, but in labor. He repaired the section of roof that had sagged under the winter snows. He built a sturdy new corral for her horse and his own. He cleared a new patch of land for a larger garden, his hands, once accustomed to the reins of a horse, learning the feel of a spade and hoe. He moved from her floor to a cot he built himself, to, eventually and naturally, her bed. Their intimacy grew as quietly and as steadily as the mountain pines, rooted in shared silence and mutual respect before it ever blossomed into passion. He learned the rhythms of her life, and she, in turn, learned the shape of his. She discovered the dry humor that lay beneath his quiet exterior, the kindness in his eyes when he watched her work. He discovered the softness she hid beneath her capable, pragmatic shell, the way she would gently touch the leaves of a plant as if it were a living creature with a story to tell. Her cabin, once a fortress of solitude, became a home. The silence was no longer a shield against grief, but a comfortable space they shared. Sometimes they would talk for hours by the fire, their histories unfolding and weaving together. Other times, they would work side by side all day without speaking a word, each knowing the other's thoughts, their movements a seamless dance of partnership. He never pushed her to leave the mountain, and she never asked him to abandon his fight. They existed in a pocket of time, a stolen piece. He was the world she had let in. She was the sanctuary he had found. One morning in late spring, as the last of the snow melted from the highest peaks, they were sitting on the porch when they heard the sound of an approaching wagon. It was not the sound of riders, but the slow, heavy creak of a family on the move. A man, his face etched with worry, pulled the wagon to a stop before the cabin. In the back, his wife lay on a bed of straw, her face pale with sweat, her body racked with a deep, chest-rattling cough. Their young daughter huddled beside her eyes wide with fear. "They said, in the town," the man stammered, looking at Alara with a desperate hope. "They said there was a healer up here. My Mary. The doctor said there's nothing more he can do. Said it's her lungs." Alara looked at the woman in the wagon, her professional gaze assessing the rapid, shallow breaths, the bluish tint to her lips. She knew this illness. She had seen it in the army camps. Pneumonia. Deadly, but not always a death sentence. Not if you knew what to do. She looked at Silas. He met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw not a question, but a quiet affirmation. This was who she was. This was what she did. He stood up and walked to the wagon. "Let's get her inside," he said to the husband, his voice calm and reassuring. "We'll help you." As Silas and the husband carefully carried the sick woman into the cabin, Alara watched them. The man she had saved was now helping her save another. Her life had come full circle. She had fled the world because of what she knew, because her skill was feared. Now that same skill was being sought out, a beacon of last hope. She had thought her work was a curse that had driven her into isolation. She now understood it was a gift that had, in the end, brought the world, a better, kinder piece of it, back to her. She followed them inside, her mind already cataloging the herbs she would need: mullein for the lungs, willow bark for the fever. The work was waiting. It was always waiting. But now she did not have to do it alone.